It is said that during the final years of a long and restless century, when the tiled domes of Isfahan still shimmered beneath winter rain, and the old bridges carried the footsteps of poets, beggars, widows, merchants, and wandering saints alike, there arrived in the city a dervish named Yunis, whose robe had become pale from years of desert dust, and whose eyes carried the silence of distant roads. Travelers once spoke of him in caravanserais from Shiraz to Tabriz, and some swore that he never remained long in any place where people laughed too loudly, for his spirit belonged more to fading songs than to celebration. He entered Isfahan at dusk while the last amber light rested softly upon the arches of the bazaar, and the air smelled of rainwater, old cedar wood, and smoke rising from copper samovars. The city moved with its usual weary elegance. Carpet sellers folded their fabrics beneath hanging lanterns. Old men gathered beneath stone alcoves speaking quietly of rulers now dead. And somewhere in the distance, a ney flute cried with such loneliness that even the stray dogs paused to listen. Yunis walked slowly through the narrow streets, leaning slightly upon a wooden staff polished smooth by many years of travel, and though he had visited Isfahan once in his youth, the city now felt to him like the face of an old friend altered by sorrow and time. The old men of Shiraz still remembered that Yunis rarely searched for comfort. Yet on that particular evening he followed the scent of brewed tea through a winding alley until he came upon a small tea-house hidden behind a curtain of dark blue fabric swaying gently in the wind. No sign hung above its entrance. Only a single candle flickered behind the window lattice, trembling softly against the rain. It is said that the tea-house had existed for many years and belonged to a widowed musician who no longer played music after losing his sight. Travelers sometimes entered seeking warmth, yet few remembered the place clearly afterward, as though melancholy itself had concealed it from memory. Yunis stepped inside and found a room lit only by candles placed upon low wooden tables. The shadows moved slowly along the walls like silent mourners. A young man poured tea near the hearth, while an old woman sorted dried mint leaves with trembling hands. In one corner sat 3 merchants speaking in hushed voices about caravans, delayed by snow beyond Kashan. And near the farthest candle, beside a small window blurred by rain, sat a woman dressed in dark green robes with silver embroidery faded from age and use. She was neither young nor old. Her face possessed that quiet beauty which belongs not to youth but to endurance. A tambour rested beside her untouched, and though many customers occasionally glanced toward her, none approached her table. Yunis seated himself near the wall, and accepted a small cup of black tea fragrant with cardamom. For a long while he said nothing. He listened only to the rain tapping gently against the roof and to the low murmur of strangers carrying their invisible burdens through the night. Then at last the woman near the window spoke without lifting her gaze from the candle before her. "You have traveled far," she said softly. Yunis looked toward her and nodded once. "Far enough to forget many things," he replied. The woman smiled faintly, though sadness remained in her eyes like smoke lingering after fire. "No man forgets," she said. "He merely places distance between himself and what follows him." The tea-house grew quieter after those words. Even the merchants ceased speaking for a moment. Yunis studied the woman carefully. Her hands rested calmly beside the untouched instrument, yet her fingers bore the delicate calluses of a musician. He sensed in her presence something deeply familiar, not because he had known her before, but because sorrow often resembles itself no matter whose face carries it. The old musician behind the counter slowly poured more tea and whispered to no one in particular. Some people enter a room carrying winter with them. Outside, the rain continued falling upon the ancient stones of Isfahan. Hours passed gently. One by one the customers disappeared into the night, until only Yunis, the woman, and the blind owner remained awake among the candles. The woman finally lifted the tambour into her lap and touched its strings so lightly that the sound seemed less like music and more like memory itself awakening from sleep. Yunis lowered his eyes. The melody was older, perhaps, than the city itself, and within it lived the ache of vanished gardens, unfinished love letters never delivered, and voices long returned to dust. Travelers once said that Yunis rarely wept, yet that night something inside him trembled like a fragile flame caught between wind and darkness. When the melody ended, silence settled over the room with almost sacred weight. Then the woman asked quietly, "Dervish, have you ever loved someone beyond the reach of time?" Yunis did not answer immediately. He watched the candlelight move across the surface of his tea like drifting gold upon dark water. At last he said, "Once, many years ago, I loved a woman whose laughter reminded me that life was merciful. Then time carried her away as rivers carry leaves." The woman nodded slowly, as though she had expected no other answer. "And did you search for her afterward?" she asked. Yunis smiled with the exhaustion of old grief. "For many years," he said, "until I understood that some searches become prisons." The woman lowered her gaze again. Beyond the rain-soaked window, the city slept beneath clouds, and somewhere far away another flute began singing into the night. The candles burned lower as the night deepened over Isfahan, and the tea-house seemed to drift farther away from the world with every passing hour. Travelers once spoke of certain places where sorrow gathered quietly like dust upon forgotten books, and that hidden room behind the rain-dark alley felt like one of those places. Yunis remained seated beside the wall while the woman gently tuned the strings of her timbre, though she did not play again immediately. The blind owner had fallen asleep near the samovar with his head resting upon folded arms, and only the faint hiss of boiling water disturbed the silence between them. Outside, the rain had softened into a silver mist floating through the narrow streets and gardens of the city. Yunis watched the woman carefully, sensing that she carried within her one of those stories that cannot easily be spoken aloud. Stories that age quietly inside the human heart until they become heavier than grief itself. It is said that dervishes often recognize sorrow in others because they spend their lives wandering beside it. After a long silence, the woman spoke again without looking toward him. "When I was young," she said softly, "this tea-house was filled with music every night. Poets sat where you now sit. Caravan travelers brought stories from distant cities. Men argued about wine and destiny until dawn. My husband played the santur near the hearth, and I sang beside him." Her voice carried neither pride nor longing, only the calm exhaustion of memory. Yunis listened quietly while the candlelight trembled across the walls. "Those were years when even sadness possessed beauty," she continued. "We were poor, yet youth protects the heart from understanding how quickly life disappears." She paused for a moment, touching the strings of the timbre with absent fingers. Then one winter sickness entered the city. Yunis lowered his eyes. He already understood the rest before she spoke it. "My husband lost his sight first," she said. "Afterward he lost his music. A musician who cannot see the movement of people, the flicker of candles, the sorrow in another face, slowly begins to disappear from himself." The blind owner stirred faintly in his sleep, as though hearing his own history whispered through dreams. The woman continued speaking softly into the dim room. "For many years we remained here together. Travelers still came, though less often. One by one the musicians vanished. Some died. Some grew old. Some abandoned beauty for survival. And the city continued breathing without noticing what it had lost." Yunis felt the familiar ache of passing time settle heavily inside him. He had wandered through countless villages and cities, only to witness the same truth repeated beneath different skies. Everything beautiful seemed destined to fade slowly before human hands could hold it long enough. "And now?" he asked gently. The woman smiled faintly, though her eyes carried immeasurable fatigue. "Now I play for ghosts," she replied. For a while neither of them spoke. Somewhere outside, the distant sound of hooves echoed briefly across wet stone before vanishing into silence again. Yunis thought of the many faces he had encountered throughout his years upon the road. Lovers waiting beside windows. Old fathers staring at empty doorways. Widows lighting candles for names no longer spoken aloud. Human beings seemed forever condemned to lose one another while continuing to live afterward. Perhaps that was the true burden of existence. Not death itself, but survival. The woman finally lifted the timbre once more and began playing another melody, quieter than the first. It carried the softness of autumn gardens at dusk and the sorrow of letters written too late. Yunis closed his eyes while the music filled the tea-house like incense. It is said that certain melodies awaken rooms hidden deep within memory, places untouched for many years. As he listened, Yunis remembered a spring evening from his youth in Shiraz, when he had once walked beside a woman through blooming orange groves, while distant musicians played near the river. He could no longer recall her exact face. Time had erased small details mercilessly, yet he remembered the warmth of her hand beneath moonlight and the unbearable certainty he once possessed that happiness might remain forever. Youth always believes such lies. The melody ended slowly like fading light upon water. When Yunis opened his eyes, the woman was watching him carefully. "You still carry her," she said. Yunis gave a weary smile. "A man carries all his unfinished sorrows, until the grave." The woman lowered her gaze again. "Then perhaps we spend our lives haunted not by people themselves, but by the versions of ourselves that existed beside them." Yunis said nothing, for her words had entered him too deeply. The candles had nearly burned down completely now, and the room glowed with that fragile golden darkness which exists only before dawn. The blind owner awoke slowly and added more water to the samovar without speaking. His movements possessed the quiet dignity of long habit. Then from somewhere beyond the alley came the faint voice of a drunken poet singing old verses into the misty streets. His song drifted through the open doorway for only a moment before disappearing again into the sleeping city. The woman listened carefully to the fading voice. "Once," she said, "men came here because they feared loneliness. Now they fear silence." Yunis looked toward the rain-blurred window where droplets slid slowly like tears across glass. "Silence reveals too much," he murmured. The woman nodded. "Especially to those who have loved deeply." A long stillness settled between them once more, yet it no longer felt empty. It felt like two weary travelers resting beside the same fire during an endless journey through darkness. At last the woman reached beneath the folds of her robe and removed a small folded letter, bound carefully with faded blue thread. The paper itself had yellowed with age. She held it gently for several moments before placing it upon the table between them. "This letter was written more than 20 years ago," she said quietly. "A traveler left it here one winter evening and never returned for it." Yunis studied the fragile paper without touching it. "Why show it to me?" he asked. The woman looked toward the trembling candle flame beside them. "Because tonight, for the first time in many years, the room no longer feels empty." Outside, the first pale hint of dawn began slowly gathering beyond the rooftops of Isfahan, while the old city dreamed beneath rain and fading stars. The dawn arrived slowly over Isfahan as though it hesitated to disturb the fragile peace of the night, and the tea-house remained wrapped in a silence that no longer felt like emptiness, but like something gently held between two breaths of time. Yunis sat motionless beside the wall while the woman's letter rested on the table between them, its faded edges trembling slightly each time the candle flame bent toward the rising air. Outside, the rain had almost ceased, leaving only wet stone and the distant sound of water dripping from rooftops into narrow alleyways. The blind owner of the tea-house moved quietly in the background, preparing the first tea of morning with the patience of someone who had learned to exist without expecting anything from the world. The woman did not touch the letter again. Instead, she watched Yunis as though waiting for something in him to respond to what words alone could not carry. It is said that some moments in life do not belong to either past or future, but hover briefly in a place where both dissolve. Yunis finally reached forward and placed his hand gently upon the folded paper, not opening it, only feeling its weight, as if it contained not ink and memory, but the quiet accumulation of years. "You still wait for him," he said softly, not as a question, but as recognition. The woman's eyes lowered, and for the first time her calm expression fractured slightly, revealing the long fatigue of waiting that had never been spoken aloud. "I stopped waiting many years ago," she replied, though her voice betrayed her words. "But the heart does not always obey decisions made by time." Yunis withdrew his hand slowly. He understood then that the letter was not meant to be read. It was meant to remain, like many things in human life, unfinished and unresolved, carrying meaning not in its content but in its existence. The candle between them flickered once more, as if acknowledging this truth, and in that trembling light, the tea-house felt suddenly older than the city itself, as though it had absorbed the residue of countless unspoken lives. Outside, the first call to morning prayer drifted faintly across the waking streets, stretching softly between rooftops and gardens, reminding the city that another day had begun, whether the heart was ready or not. Yunis stood slowly, his joints heavy from travel and sleeplessness, and adjusted the worn fabric of his robe. The woman remained seated, her fingers resting lightly on the timbre without playing it. For a long moment neither of them spoke. It is said that certain encounters in life are not meant to continue beyond their appointed hour, for their meaning exists only in passing. Yunis looked toward the doorway, where pale light now touched the edges of the curtain. "You should keep the letter," he said quietly. The woman nodded without resistance. "It has kept me long enough already," she answered. There was no sorrow in her voice now, only acceptance, like water finally settling after wind has passed. Yunis turned toward the door, yet paused just before stepping out into the morning. He did not look back immediately, for he understood that looking back often creates burdens the future cannot carry. Still, after a moment he did. The woman met his gaze briefly, and in that shared silence there was neither promise nor regret, only recognition between two travelers who would never meet again in the same way. Then Yunis stepped outside. The air of morning was cool and washed clean by rain, carrying the scent of stone, tea, and distant bread baking in unseen ovens. The alleyway stretched before him like a path newly written upon the earth. Behind him, the tea house remained quietly alive, its candle now extinguished, its shadows dissolving into daylight. He walked slowly without destination as he always did. Yet something within him felt slightly altered, as though a small room had been opened inside his chest where sound once lived too loudly. Travelers once said that Yunis never carried souvenirs from the places he visited, yet that morning he carried something unseen. Not an object, but a quiet understanding that every life, no matter how brief its crossing, leaves behind a trace in another heart that cannot be erased by time. And as he walked deeper into the waking streets of Isfahan, the city received him without question, as it had received countless others before him. While behind him, the tea house faded gently into the rhythm of ordinary morning, where memory and forgetting continued their endless and tender exchange.